Hi there. Let's begin our lecture on bioweapons. Bioweapons is the process of using any living organism or virus as a weapon to attack an enemy. The end result is usually death or disease of people or plants or animals of their enemy. Bioweapons are typically not used to stop an army. Rather, they're used typically against citizens or armies to create chaos and slow progression. Also, bioweapons can be used by terrorists and defeated countries in retaliation of dominant governments. Bioweapons can be used by placing the infectious agent in food or water of the enemy, or released into the air in a public space. Historically, bioweapons have been used for quite some time. There's debate about whether or not biblical times and biblical records indicate that there was the use of bioweapons in the past. It's thought that perhaps some of the plagues of Egypt thousands of years ago were, in fact, the use of anthrax. Then, in 6th century BC, the Assyrians poisoned the enemy drinking wells with rye ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions if ingested. But really, the first recorded use of officially using a bioweapon against an enemy was the plague. The plague broke out in a Tartar army during its siege of Kaffa, which is today modern-day Crimea near the Black Sea. The Tartar army was trying to attack Kaffa, which had very high walls, making it difficult to overrun the city. And when the plague broke out in the Tartar army ended up wondering what they could do with all the dead bodies of their brethren, as they were themselves running out of food and weapons. So what they ended up doing was hurling corpses of plague victims over the city walls, using them as weapons themselves. This ended up causing an epidemic that forced the city of Kaffa to surrender. The reason why this was effective was not because the corpses themselves caused people to get sick, but because the corpses housed fleas in the clothes that carried bubonic plague, and those fleas ended up hopping off of the clothes and attacking the residents of the city of Kaffa, spreading the plague inside the city. It's thought that after the citizens of Kaffa surrendered to the Tartar army, that some of them fled and ended up going west, leading to the Black Death epidemic that spread around Europe during those times. This occurred in 1346, so almost 700 years ago. This actually continued, where armies that were attacking walled cities would end up flinging corpses and other disease agents over city walls using catapults to attack the people of those cities. It continued until 1710, which was the last instance of using plague victims to attack a city. Russia was attacking a city in Sweden, and similar to long ago, ended up flinging plague corpses over the city walls. This tactic is no longer used, mostly because cities don't have city walls anymore. And so transmitting disease and bioweapons requires different techniques. One of those techniques that was a possibility was in 1754, so just roughly 40 years later, during the French and Indian Wars in what was soon to be the United States. The French and Indian Wars were when the French and the Native Americans in North America got together and joined forces against the British Army. The British Army was thought to have possibly donated and distributed smallpox-laden blankets to the Native Americans loyal to the French, thereby transmitting smallpox to these native groups. The reason why the British didn't do this with the French is because most Europeans at the time would get smallpox, and any adult that was still alive was almost certainly to have had smallpox and survived smallpox in their youth, meaning they would be immune to the disease. This tactic was effective against Native people because Native people did not tend to have smallpox, and thereby all of the adults would be susceptible to the disease. In 1915, the use of bioweapons continued. This would be during World War I. What happened then was German undercover agents infected the livestock, not the people, of Allied troops in Europe with Burkholderia malii. This causes a disease known as glanders, which results in fatal infections in humans that consume the livestock sick with this bacterial disease. Then, in the run-up to World War II, in 1937, Japan began a biological warfare program officially run by their government. Japanese researchers used anthrax and other diseases on prisoners of war and Chinese nationals that they had captured. This human experimentation was appalling and started the Japanese biological warfare program. In 1940, just 3 years later, plague epidemics in China began to occur at a much higher rate, and these occurred in small towns that followed attacks by Japanese planes. It was reported that there were flights by Japanese planes that would drop items in support of and to provide for Chinese citizens. This was an attempt by the Japanese to try to create beneficial propaganda in support of their war efforts with the Chinese. But, interestingly, just after dropping these goods, these villages also reported plague outbreaks, possibly indicating that the items that were dropped were infected with fleas carrying the plague. In 1942, the Allies of World War II began experimenting with their own biowarfare program. Gruniard Island, off the coast of Scotland, was a place for British military experimentation. The British military was experimenting with anthrax bombs, packing bombs with anthrax bacteria, and testing to try to get them to disperse the anthrax into the air without incineration that would cause death of the bioweapon itself. They tested so many anthrax bombs on this small island that eventually it was realized the British government needed to clean up the island because no animal could live on the island without acquiring anthrax. The contamination was so great that in 1986, the British military decontaminated the island from the anthrax spores. This required 280 tons of formaldehyde, a very potent carcinogen and dangerous chemical used as embalming fluid and preservation of tissues in many research fields. Then the formaldehyde needed to be washed off the island. To do this, the British military pumped 2,000 tons of seawater onto the island to wash the formaldehyde into the ocean. Not the best solution, but it did seem to work. Also, in 1942, during World War II, the United States was making their own bioweapons programs, producing their own anthrax bombs. In fact, the US produced 5,000 anthrax bombs during that time. After World War II was over and the world was at peace for a few decades, in 1969, Richard Nixon signed an executive order to end bioweapons research and production. Of course, research continued to investigate ways of defending our country against bioweapons, but anthrax bombs and offensive weapons programs were halted. The Russian government during the Cold War also had indicated that they stopped their bioweapons programs as well. But then, in 1979, there was a discovery that in fact there was a bioweapons plant still producing bioweapons in Russia. The reason this came to light was because this particular bioweapons plant in Sverdlovsk, Russia, accidentally released anthrax spores into the air. In this small town, there were reports of 66 confirmed deaths. But because this was during communist Russia and the media was regularly used for propaganda, those 66 confirmed deaths were probably much, much less than the actual number. This sort of ended a lot of the US government and major governments' exploration of offensive bioweapons programs. Now, most of the bioweapons programs, at least officially, are used defensively to protect citizens and not to attack other countries. In the United States, this is still done today in Fort Detrick. You can see from older pictures, Fort Detrick was where anthrax bombs and explorations into bioweapons research first began. Now, Fort Detrick has, of course, much updated technology and facilities, but they're still doing bioweapons research to investigate effective vaccines and protective measures in order to protect citizens of the United States and detect whether or not a bioweapon has been used in the US. Now, while the federal government no longer officially uses any facilities to attack any other country or individual, there are terrorist groups and individual terrorists that have used bioweapons to attack the US government and other governments around the world. We're going to talk about those in our next section.